Johnson. Title I was funded, and in my local school, close to my college, they were looking for teacher's aides, and they were paying a lot more than work study was. I had absolutely no plans to be a teacher, and I absolutely fell in love with the process of understanding how children, and these were mostly children of migrant workers and very low-income folks in Fresno, California, I just became fascinated by what was going on or what wasn't going on. So in California at that point, one needed to have a BA degree in something other than education. Education wasn't a major. But I managed to do my student teaching and get education courses for a credential as I got my BA degree in history. And I began teaching after I'd gotten a master's degree at the University of Illinois. And as I taught, I began asking questions. And it was those questions that led me to graduate school. So it was a heady time in education. So it was a time when some of the solutions offered perhaps by computers were starting to be introduced, specifically things like hierarchical learning structures, you know, like a pre-test, post-test with key objectives for those skills. And I was in a school district that just adopted everything as a first level of adopter. And so we had this just really perplexing, you know, mastery learning system of just enormous. There was a whole building just full of worksheets. So my second graders would, you know, basically what I did for part of every school day was do after the kids did pre-tests, I would grade them because that wasn't computerized at that time. But the idea of breakdowns of learning were. And so I'd, you know, be assigning worksheets. The kids would go into this building to get the worksheets, and then they'd do the post-test. And I'd look at these assessments and I'd go, how can you base an understanding of students on this information? And furthermore, I was also teaching students to read with books. And I knew some students were really good readers, but they were doing very poorly on these assessments. So that was one big question I had. Another one was why the senior teachers at the school told me to put kids in these ability groups. Because I came out, I mean, I'd had a master's degree from the University of Illinois before the Center for the Study of Reading. But I had some really good instructors like Dolores Durkin. I didn't know what to do when I actually got in the classroom. But I couldn't understand, why would you want to put kids and label them in a certain way? So I went with those questions to graduate school. So it was those underlying questions that got me started. To reading. I was introduced to reading with, this is a later copyright, because I couldn't find the one that was used in the Canadian prairies in the mid-1950s. But here were these kids who lived in these towns with white picket fences and had grandparents who had these people had dogs in their houses and cats. You know, and I'm the child of refugees, you know, who just didn't think you should have dogs and cats in your house, nor did I have grandparents who I could really talk to because they spoke German and I wasn't fluent in German by that point anymore. So I was just perplexed by the text, but I did learn to read quickly with whatever the system was. And then when I was in grade 3, our family moved from the Canadian prairies, a little town of maybe 300, to Vancouver. And they had a new system, and that was called phonics. So you had reading, and then you had phonics. And I was so bad at this thing called phonics that I was sent to a special teacher. Now, how humiliating was that? Plus, I kind of sussed out that this teacher was a little weird and I didn't want to spend too much time with him. So whatever he was teaching, I was learning really fast. That's where my incredible interest with the reading process began. But it was really when I was teaching that the research questions became apparent. I had a wonderful advisor at Wisconsin, Steve Usen, who recognized my creativity and let that be okay, and my curiosity. In fact, he nourished it. And to me, that was really a gift, because people hadn't always responded to me like that. So Steve was really, really important. And then there've just been a host of people. I mean, just take a look at all the people I've gotten to co-author with. I mean, I got to work on the Commission on Reading when I was like, 4 years into my the professorate, and I got to spend time sitting with people like Jean Chall. It actually still gives me the goosebumps to just think of the opportunities that I had. I got to work on a day-to-day basis with Dick Anderson and be at the Center for the Study of Reading and meet people and interact with them as colleagues. But to be able to sit and talk with Jean, because she actually did come from a generation where there had been some women who had been in higher education, but not many of them were still there. So it was like I would always ask the same question. So what was it that sustained you? And Jean would say, it's the questions. You've got to be curious about things. You know, Isabel Beck was at the peak of her career. And to be able to be on, she was always giving advice, not just about career things, but also about outfits that you wore at conferences, very important. So I was just incredibly blessed to have this venue where I could see much beyond my own world early in my career. And then I got to forge relationships with people like David Pearson, who has been he's a sustaining colleague over many, many decades, and many other people. I mean, now I feel like I'm being really influenced by a new generation of scholars, like Gina Cervetti, who's teaching me so much about the role of knowledge in text. So I feel like, or Devin Kearns, who knows more about word characteristics than anybody I could ever believe would know that much. So I just continue to be really fortunate in these experiences that I have, in these people I get to work with and to get to meet. I, at one point, counted all the co-authors David had for his Festschrift, but I haven't done that for myself. And so I don't know how many people, but I've gotten to learn on so many different things with so many different people. So I think a very obvious one was becoming a nation of readers, getting to work with the Commission on Reading, getting to work on a policy document. I think what was really critical about becoming a nation of readers is to see the effects of something that was good intention and that you worked on, that was evidence-based. I mean, in some cases there wasn't evidence. I mean, we had information about how readability formulas worked and the mischief or the havoc they were doing. But we didn't always have things to fill in the gaps. And what I learned from that is that what you do or say as a researcher can actually create if it's implemented, it can create a vacuum, and into that vacuum can come things that are unexpected. I mean, it's the notion of unintended consequences. And I think that notion of unintended consequences has really influenced the work that I've done since. I mean, so I look at, what are the unintended consequences of, for example, using a new system that has a really cool name, Lexiles. but what could be, and it's efficient and it uses large digital databases, but what are the consequences of that? What are the consequences of the Common Core State Standards putting into a document for the first time ever nationally, and also most states never had, prescribed levels of text complexity? Sometimes those would be implicit, sometimes those would be discussed in state departments of education with publishers, but never did we have a document where it said, these are the levels and we're going to up the ante. And I brought up the notion of unintended consequences really early on in the process with the people who were writing it. Just because you have good ideas, though, doesn't mean people will always listen to you. And then I've done a dissertation, and my early work was on early literacy, something that Bill Thiel and Elizabeth Sulsby came to call emergent literacy. When I was doing the dissertation, we didn't know what to call it. That was just about 5 years before they published their book with the title Emergent Literacy. Let me reflect on the work on early literacy. In some ways, I saw the work make an impact. Okay, so I was involved in a core reading program in 1989 where we actually were the first program to have a book that kindergartners would hold in their hands. It didn't have any words in it, it just had pictures. And to me, that was such an accomplishment. And what I've seen happen since, I really hope that we weren't doing mischief with that, because before that, kids have been doing these horrific reading readiness activities. Just really boring, like, which shape is different than the other shapes, and, things like that, which had been shown to not have it make any difference. And now, kindergarten, I think, is even more, the benchmark for the end of kindergarten is even higher than it often was for first grade. So in that way, I'm not talking about how the research has changed, because no one has been doing any research on that change. And I think that's surprising to me. So in some of these areas, there have just been dramatic changes, and people haven't been asking questions about it. So I think a change that I've seen is less attention to really researching critical questions in some really important aspects of children's daily lives in schools. I'm not saying that there aren't people doing empirical studies on early learning. So we see in the experimental literature many, many studies on looking at correlates and predictors, but we're not seeing people actually look at some of these fundamental practices and what's appropriate for young kids. So I've actually seen a dearth of research in my field that can truly give the information to teachers. Teachers are really hungry right now for information about alternatives to level text that they understand really have no underlying basis, that have just been written to comply with length or, some sense of text structure. But I'm not seeing people research. So my advice is, what Jeannie Chall said. Keep asking questions and keep being curious. That's what she said. I've always asked questions, and I'm curious. And that is what I think, and not just curious about, like, can I do this? Or curious about, like, what accolades I can get. It's curious about the kids and the question and the work. It's the work, which I still get up every morning and I do this writing. What message would I give policymakers? And the policymakers I'm going to focus on are at a state or actually big district level. because that's a context in which I'm currently working. And one of the things that I think is the most critical message that we can deliver at this point is that, you know, you actually have to read to get good at it. And it's not just saying, as I did on one book title, read more, read better. It's here are the ways for kids who are on their handhelds and iPads and whatever a lot of the time. Here are some very concrete things that can be done. So I've recently gotten the URL, Small Changes for Teachers, because it's not been populated yet. It will be soon. But I'm wanting to identify things that could make a step forward. You know, what's something that you could do that would be workable, that would increase kids' reading? And it's not just to read more, but it's to read to know more. Whether it's to know more about myself through narrative, or to know more about the natural and social world. So my message right now, and that in 10 days I'm going to be doing work with a school district, a very large school district, and that's the message. You know, texts are where human beings have always stored their knowledge. And to participate in this knowledge era, you need knowledge, and knowledge comes from text, and the more knowledge you know, it begets knowledge, and so on. That's what my message is.